thanks to everyone for coming out here. Thanks to all the work that goes in from the sponsors and organizers, but especially over a weekend. I have mixed feelings about weekend conferences. I'm really, really pleased and proud to see that so many people have made the effort to go here. All right, enough. Let's continue with this. The future of continuous delivery. Before we can talk about that in a lot of detail, let's spend a few minutes reminiscing, wallowing in the glories of the past to figure out how we got to where we are today. So in the beginning, there was primordial ooze of deployment. There were, rivers of molten bash. There were endless works, endless Word documents describing how to do things. There were, not zip drives because they hardly existed back then, handed around with instructions on how to do things. I have personally experienced, somebody probably remembers as well, things like FTPing from your laptop into a production website server and live updating, that kind of stuff. The days when production mobile apps were deployed from a developer's IDE, because that was the only way you could do it, in fact. Data science models deployed straight from some Jupyter notebook into production to make credit scores. We've all kind of been there. I hear some chuckles. Like, there's a long, long list of the kind of primordial ooze of development and deployment. And then, of course, the sun rises, we discover CI and CD, and wonderful things happen, and are we all super happy, and the world is in a great place? And, well, of course, the answer inevitably initially is kind of no, because where we end up is a place a bit like this. CI and CD are kind of discovered by different parts of your organization, different teams, and they discover that you need lots of little pieces to glue together to make this kind of thing work. And so everybody invents their own little Rube Goldberg device. And of course, the reason for the white space in this diagram is because there are still plenty of places in your organization where there is not even a Rube Goldberg device. There is still, manuals and worksheets and all kinds of things that are used to do all these deployment things. So that's obviously not a great state to be in, like random amounts of Rube Goldberg love everywhere, lots of duct tape. And as an industry, I think we obviously recognize this, and there were, I'd say, two main approaches that were taken to try to solve this problem. One of them looked a bit like this. I'll leave you a bit of time to look at it and spot the joke in one of the lines in the bottom there. But, the idea that if you can, somebody spotted the joke, very good. The idea that if you can make the runtime just really simple and just, take care of all the problems for the developer, then all these kind of Rube Goldberg devices go away, because you just have a bit of code to worry about and like everything else is handled. And it's true. I mean, this was a very nice and compelling experience for a lot of use cases, but of course the challenge was that it was only for some of those use cases that you need in a company. So you had a bit of this stuff, a bit of the pass, wonderful passness around, and then you had all these areas where it didn't fit. And so you ended up with a situation that wasn't hugely better from the other one. And of course, this could be an entire other talk, like pass communities and vendors, and we have our community colleagues from Pivotal here. They can talk about this in much more detail. Recognize this, and there was lots of work to try and make them more extensible and more pluggable and more complicated. Well, that wasn't the point, but that's, of course, where they ended up. So I think it's fair to say that isn't the solution that we found that really solved all the problems. So where we ended up is basically the other option that we tried in the community. Where are we now? We're at a place that I think looks a little bit like this. Like this. Like this. There is one centralized Rube Goldberg device, typically called the standardized or the platform Rube Goldberg device. And aspirationally, that covers 85% of the use cases that you want to cover in your organization. And then there is some, because we know fiat doesn't work and we can't force everyone to use this, there is this exception process that you can ask for, and then you can build your own Rube Goldberg device. And so there's still this layer of crazy Rube Goldberg devices. I think I was speaking to a Gartner analyst a while back. They were talking about progress in this space. They were interviewing, I think 2 years ago, they interviewed heads of engineering or heads of whatever that title is, and asking them about the number of tool chains that they thought they had in their company. And it used to be about 5, and then they asked them last year again, and it's now 25. And they conclude that it's not that they actually have more now, that they actually at least know that they have 25 now. Like 2 years ago, they didn't even know. TLDR, there's just a lot of stuff going on. But now, if we compare it back, a few slides back, we had lots of white space. No more white space. Great, right? All covered in Rube Goldberg devices. So, we done? Yay. No, of course, we're not. Like, this is probably not the end game that we want to reach. And I guess the question is, why? Why is this a problem? Looks pretty nice, right? Well, no. I mean, this is still incredibly complicated. Like, this is some screenshot of there's an interesting blog where somebody's collecting real-world examples of CI/CD. And, I think for most people in this room, they're experts in this space. It's like, sure, yeah, makes total sense. But like, if you show this to like an average, I don't know, developer person, this is a head-exploding picture of complexity. So, as I said, why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because it's still really complicated. But there are some more subtle problems or more challenging problems here as well. One of them is, does this thing have a back button? Maybe it doesn't really matter. One of them is that it is pretty difficult with most of the tools that are collected together in a picture like that to give teams progressive layers of control. So you typically have a very binary choice as a platform team or a DevOps team or an SRE team, whatever you want to call it. You have a choice between, well, we own the whole thing, and you just get our guardrails. Or you have the choice of like, yay, config as code, we'll put it all in the repo. But it's very hard then to sort of say, well, we'll give you like 60% control or 20% control. Or we'll give you control over these little areas of the problem space. It's pretty much of an all or nothing thing. And in a large organization where you inevitably need to have more control in some areas but less in others, that's a challenge. And then the other big challenge, of course, is that there's a huge amount of operational toil involved in running all these systems. Because by and large, if we were to pick some quote-unquote industry standards in this space, it's all stuff you've got to figure out how to install, how to run, how to maintain. Some of the famous examples don't scale very well, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're at a kind of point where this is where we're at. We've got the centralized Rube Goldberg device. But there's still, I think, a way to go. So what are the main challenges that we think we're facing today? I would say that there are sort of 3 main challenges that teams working in these areas are facing. The first one, how do we make it sufficiently simple for 80% of our developers to do their work, whilst at the same time, focusing on that second problem, allowing us to give progressively more control to those teams that need it? So, in other words, how do we avoid the lesson from the first generation of PaaS approaches where we could make it easy for 80%, but there was no sort of progressive trapdoor capability? And then the third part is, how do I manage to solve that problem without having to build my own full platform ground up from scratch? Because, yes, you can certainly solve this problem by building a custom in-house platform, but that's kind of a lot of work. So I think if we look at the market today, if we look at this space today, there are kind of 3 trends that are being picked up to try to solve this particular problem. Treating app delivery rather than CD is the problem to solve. Using commodity components as a way to run and maintain this thing, and moving towards a declarative approach. Now, this isn't really super new. I mean, there's a bunch of quote-unquote DevOps elite organizations represented in the audience here today. And so for most of them, certainly 1 and 2, or 1 and partially 3 maybe, well, maybe 1 and partially 3 and partially 2 aren't anything new. I think 2 is a sort of continuous delivery foundation type discussion that I'll talk about a little bit. It's still generally a challenge to find good commodity components. But TLDR is like, there are certainly people who are already doing this successfully today. And we've heard talks in today's program about things like managed delivery. Let me come back to that in a second. We probably know what these things are. But We still need to tackle them at the large. So the first point here is, we've thought about maybe CI or CD as individual problems. But it pays to zoom out a bit, right? That was the ear. What we're really recognizing is that the problem we're trying to solve, if we go back to that crazy overall diagram, is not like each individual box on its own, which was kind of, I think, our prior approach. The real issue we're all trying to solve is how to make our developers productive. And the recognition in that space is that you can't do that just by picking one tool in each specialized niche and sort of wrapping them up in a ball of duct tape and then handing them to developers. You really have to start thinking through the entire software delivery process with a sort of PaaS-like fit, but tailored to your own organization and your own tooling and your own services and your own applications. And one of the corollaries of that, in some sense, is that it's not just about running the Rube Goldberg device, that's the little video on the right. It's also about setting it up, which is the one on the left. Where previously a lot of the focus was on like, okay, well, people will follow whatever, click through 10 million UIs to set things up. I think the focus is pretty clear now that what we're trying to solve for is everything from the moment that the development team gets started. How do they set up their issue tracking? How do they set up their repos? How do they set up their projects? How can I make that an easy experience? And then, of course, how do I wire up all the things that the team will need to use, hopefully under the covers, so that when they start actually doing work, they have this chat ops and all that kind of good stuff just working for them. And again, going back to the diagram, there's lots of components here. There's like, we talked about CI, we talked about artifact management, secure software supply chain, all the digital signing, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So a corollary to this, I want to make it easy as a centralized team for my dev teams to set up this entire bag of tools. I want to give them a PaaS-like experience, and I want it to run smoothly. But I don't want to have to assemble millions and millions of different things and have lots of toil. My favorite example here, of course, we all know where this comes from. I can almost furnish an entire house with one tool. It's pretty nice. That's a pretty sort of commodity way of thinking about this problem. And I think what we're seeing in this particular space on the continuous delivery side is that that centralized team wants to create a nice, simple experience, but it also wants to reduce the amount of balls they have to juggle in order to make that work. And so, having a more standardized, more centralized approach to the actual technology, the components that are needed to build an app delivery stack or an app delivery suite, I think is a clear trend in the market. I think obviously, no surprise, Kubernetes is emerging as the kind of de facto, this is going to be our DevOps control plane. Our monitoring should run in there, our CI should run in there, our CD should run in there, and so on and so forth. That is still a long way to go in this market, but I think that is kind of where we're heading right now. And of course, what's also critical is that the components that you end up using are portable and open, because everybody knows the multi-cloud story. Nobody wants to have massive lock-in in the sector and so on. It's nice if you can reduce your toil by having hosted versions of these components as well. That's, of course, a benefit. But I guess the key point here is that as far as these underlying components of your systems are concerned, you're not that interested in the whole shrink-wrapped end-to-end product experience. You're interested in the APIs and the ability to programmatically control them and so on. But I think what is pretty clear if you look at whether it's the DORA reports, the State of DevOps reports, or these kind of things, or if you look at some examples from a lot of the companies here, if you truly want to go to the sort of extremes of productivity and security and all these kind of things, if you want to do the DevOps elite thing, then you have to have some amount of your own kind of, I don't know, your own, what am I looking for the word, your own opinions and your own tailored approach, and having a shrink-wrap product isn't really going to solve this for you. So we talked about two things. We talked about like the end-to-end app delivery experience. We talked about commodity components as a runtime. And the third one is declarative. What do I mean by that? Again, it's nothing new. The word today means all kinds of things. It sort of has been conflated with config as code. Then the word GitOps comes in the mix, which also means everything to everyone. It's just an unfortunate tendency of every successful phrase. I think the thing about declarative, and for me, yes, as a sort of API style, we can wax lyrically about how important it is and how useful it is. But I think that the really interesting part of declarative and the real benefit to it is that it allows us to give developers that progressive degree of freedom that I was talking about. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is I can, if I want to impose a policy, say that I don't want to drive on highways, but I don't want the developers to be able to choose that. I can give them this kind of thing, and I can centrally lock down the don't use highways button, option, and then I can do the route planning. I can do the YAML generation would be the more technical example, but I can do the route planning without them having to be able to influence that. And I can do that for many more of these attributes. Compare this approach to getting to your location with this approach, which is a rally driver's, co-driver's note sheet, right? It means go left 5 degrees, whatever, fast, slow. Try and impose a policy when your instructions are at this kind of level. Can you look at this thing, a Jenkins file, for example? This is the equivalent. And can you look at this thing and impose a high-level policy such as don't go on highways? Well, it's possible, but it's really hard because you have to basically parse code and try to inject policy at that level. And that makes it very, very difficult to make any kind of meaningful high-level statements. So when we're working in imperative deployment modes, that's where I think a lot of this all or nothing comes from. Once you get the ability to basically put arbitrary commands in the sequence, it's very difficult to reason abstractly about what these arbitrary commands mean. And giving developers degrees of freedom is exactly related to the ability of the central team to reason and impose requirements or constraints about what you can do. So again, if you have a declarative delivery file, say, which says, these are the constraints or these are the conditions under which I want to deploy, that's a much higher level statement than looking at your CI/CD pipeline tooling and looking at the individual configuration steps. And that, I think, is one of the key reasons why declarative is going to be very important and powerful. To be clear, YAML template generation is not the ideal user experience in order to make this work, but the general approach that we should be thinking in the what and not in the how gives us a very powerful mechanism of these low-level degrees of control. Okay, so 3 themes that I think we were just talking about. We were talking about looking at app delivery as the big picture, looking at customized, or rather commodity components, and looking at, yes, the declarative approach to this entire thing. Where does Spinnaker fit in here? So first of all, if we look at the first one, solving for app delivery, I don't think Spinnaker legitimately can or should expand its scope to try to become a GitLab-like solution. I don't think that's necessary. But what I think we see, if we look at how in fact, some of the leading Spinnaker users and how many companies think about it, you are looking at it as part of your platform. And in order to make it part of your platform, it has to have very good support for programmatic management, API interactions, as codability. We can do more in the area, and to be clear, I'm not prescribing a roadmap here. Some of these are my thoughts. Some of these things are already in the roadmap. As an aside, it was published, and I'll call it out again. It's on the Spinnaker IO page. There's a roadmap update for the next year, so please feel free to have a look. Tomorrow there's a Ask Me Anything panel on that subject as well, so we're very keen to hear your thoughts about this. But I think if we think about this, app delivery is an end-to-end process that starts with issues or bugs and ends with those bugs hopefully being resolved. Spinnaker already has some capabilities to do things like understanding test failures and so on and so forth. But we can do more to integrate understanding of the end-to-end metadata flowing through the system. And then, and this is an entire question mark for me, just a sort of random off the top of my head's idea, if you're going to use Spinnaker as a component in a broader platform, maybe you don't want to consume the UI as one entire thing, but maybe you want to consume bits of it. So that might be an interesting, and I know there's work obviously going on around pluggability in the UI as well. Might be an interesting angle here. If we talk about commodity components, well, I think one obvious angle that is already being looked at and has already started with things like the custom stage based on the run job stage in Kubernetes and so on, is to have more pluggability through containers. There's a lot of work in the community right now, some interesting RFCs around pluggability in general. I think what we're seeing, especially given that Kubernetes is becoming the de facto runtime of choice for DevOps tools, is that pluggability at the container level is an obvious thing that we should be moving towards. There's the CDF, and again, that's, if you look at the interest in projects like Tekton, which are very unashamedly not product-focused, very much focused around low-level components that you can use in other products. That's a very interesting kind of direction we're seeing interest in the community. And the irony is that Spinnaker, in some sense, was way ahead of the game as well in this case. Spinnaker is really a bag of components in some ways, too. Compared to other tools in this space that were very strongly monolithic and kind of everything is in one process, Spinnaker has been, from very early on, a collection of components that are pretty specialized in their own tasks. And if you ask sophisticated users of Spinnakers, that's kind of also often how they think of Spinnaker, as a set of components that they can use in their broader platforms. And so I think as the industry interest in this area comes up, there's definite work we can do in the Spinnaker community to explore potential combinations here. The classic example, you could run a Tekton task in the Spinnaker pipeline. I don't have the answers for what the right approach here is, but there's definitely a way we can think about this. And it goes the other way too. We just finished a workshop on canary analysis. Kayenta is one of those classic examples of a component that can, and in fact already is, there's a talk tomorrow about that from Nike, used outside of the context of Spinnaker. So I think that is another great example of a relatively standalone, potentially component that can be used in broader contexts. And that's basically what I'm saying with this third bullet point here. Just think about Spinnaker not just as this shrink-wrapped thing that you can install and then it's all ready, it's shiny UI, and you can get started from there, but actually as a set of components. And I think we can do more from the community side to actually explain how these components could be used individually, give them a little bit more of their own individual identity, if you like, and in some cases also make it easier to run and use them in their own right. And then, of course, coming to the third point about declarative abstractions, I think one level of abstraction, this is kind of us challenging ourselves to have a declarative or a more declarative approach, especially for Kubernetes deployments. How can we provide an out-of-the-box abstraction where you just want to say, I want this to run over there, give me some strategy to apply, we will make it happen. I think it's legitimate to say that Kubernetes, given that it's still relatively early days, people want quite a low level of fine-grained control, but we're getting to the point where people are starting to adopt it and they don't want to have to think about all the gory details, all the gory YAML, and we can do something here to provide a higher level abstraction. Obviously, in some ways, pipeline templates, given the way that they allow for multiple inheritance and things like that, and the way you can express more declarative approaches to your pipelines. I wouldn't say fully declarative. A pipeline inherently is still a relatively imperative construct. But I think some of the work going on in there supports the idea of having fine-grained control, which I think ultimately is what, between rather the centralized team and the developer teams, I think that's largely what declarative is a lot of the benefit there. And then, of course, managed delivery. Those of you who came to the talk earlier today, an effort at Netflix that I think is very much in line with these kind of ideas and thoughts. Okay, so moving forward, wrap up with this one. I think as an industry where we've been struggling kind of with a standardized Rube Goldberg approach as the pattern that we've been living with for a while, but we are definitely starting to move past that, to leave that behind. We're thinking about app delivery platforms as a broader problem space, which has the job of it is to create a smooth developer experience all the way from setup to deployment and monitoring and runtime troubleshooting, using commodity components with declarative abstractions and very often brokered by platform teams or centralized teams or DevOps teams whose job it is to create the appropriate abstractions for their own organizations. And I think for me, the key, the interesting point is, of course, there's lots of work going on in the Spinnaker community that ties into all these particular trends. And of course, it's a community. There's way more work on the plate and in the idea sphere than we could possibly do, the main contributors. So we're here to welcome any new contributors with as open arms as we possibly can. And if you have any questions about how you can do that, then of course please come to see me or anyone from the Spinnaker Steering Committee or the TOC or any one of the contributors here today. So, third time around, can we get there? I certainly hope so, and I hope you will help us do so. Thank you very much.